Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 232, The Ottomans, from Mehmet the Conqueror to Selim the Grim, 1444 to 1520. Now, these last dozen or so episodes we've examined the genesis of two of the three major strategic preoccupations of the Habsburg Empire, the rivalry with the French kings and the relationship with the imperial princes. Now today, we'll look at the build-up of the third major strategic challenge to the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, and that's the Ottomans. Now, one can argue, and many have, that the threat of an Ottoman invasion in the 1520s and 1530s is what prevented the Emperor Charles V from clamping down on the Protestants in the empire. And by the time the border had stabilised and the Habsburgs could again focus on the religious and political goings-ons in German lands, it was too late to reverse events. There's an element of irony here that I will refrain from elaborating on. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Christian nations of Western Europe assumed that they could regain the ancient capital of Byzantium and even Jerusalem, if only they were united under a crusading banner. But by the time Suleiman the Magnificent appeared before Belgrade in 1521, that had become inconceivable. The Christian nations, and in particular the Habsburgs, were on their back foot, and they knew it. So, what had happened in these 70 years that made the Ottoman armies appear unbeatable? Now let's start with the city of Constantinople itself. When Mehmet II took it, he allowed his army to sack what was left of the once mighty capital of the Roman Empire. How much there was still to take is a bit of a question. Its population had shrunk from almost 500,000 in the days of Justinian to barely 50,000 souls. Its churches and palaces had been stripped of valuables, first by the Catholic Crusaders in 1204 and then by the late emperors, desperate to fund the defense of their shrinking realm. Its trade had shifted away to Aleppo and Cairo. As the prominent Turkish historian Halil İnalcık called it, the dead center of a dead empire. There was hence no rational reason to revive the city of Constantinople, let alone make it the capital of the new empire. The purpose, if there was one, relates to a hadith, a saying by the Prophet Muhammad, that, quote, "Constantinople will be conquered. Blessed is the commander who will conquer it, and blessed are his troops." Now it's important to remember that the early Ottoman sultans had no legitimacy for their rule, other than their military might. They weren't descendants of the Prophet, nor could they claim ownership on the basis of inheritance. They were just a Turkic tribe made good. By breaking the Theodosian walls, Mehmet II had fulfilled a destiny set by the Prophet, a task Muslim rulers had failed in since the 7th century. And that elevated him to a spiritually sanctioned level. Constantinople had to thrive as a Muslim city to prove that the Sultan was the rightful ruler and the leader of the Islamic world. And thrive the city did. By the end of Mehmet II's reign, the city had grown by 50%, and by 1550 it had almost fully recovered. But it did not become an exclusively Muslim city as many in the Ottoman camp had wished for. Instead, it turned into a melting pot that reflected the ethnic and religious mix of the lands the Sultan ruled. Mehmet invited Muslims from all over his possessions to come and live in the new capital, but he did not expel its Orthodox Christian inhabitants, and many other religious groups arrived there too, seeking advancement. To fill the empty streets and rebuild the ruins, Mehmet II ordered the Jews of Thessaloniki to be resettled in Constantinople. At the end of his reign, the city proper is estimated at 60% Muslim, 20% Greek Orthodox, 11% Jewish, 5% Armenian and 2% Italian. Meanwhile, Pera and Galata, across the Golden Horn, housed only 35% Muslims, but 39% Greek Orthodox, 22% Italians, most of them from Genova, and 4% Armenians. Now, this toleration of different religions was one of the many features in which the Ottoman Empire differed fundamentally from the Christian nations. Though the Bible and the Quran both take a dim view of forced conversions, the Christians practiced it with abandon. Whilst the Muslims stayed closer to their original text, which states, "Whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve." Mehmet II appointed leaders for the recognized religions: Sunni Islam, Greek Orthodoxy, Judaism, and Armenian Christianity, and gave them seats and places of worship in the capital. Of course, Sunni Islam received the prime sites. Minarets dominated the appearance of the city, and many churches, including the greatest building on earth at the time, the Hagia Sophia, were turned into mosques. But the other religions were allowed to keep, even to build, new places of worship. Their religious leaders became the political and judicial representatives of their community. They were given administrative, fiscal, and legal powers to regulate the spiritual and private affairs of their members. They oversaw judicial courts, operated schools, seminaries, hospitals, even jails. They registered deaths and marriages. Jewish and Christian leaders sat on the imperial council and could reach high positions in Ottoman society, and if they were prepared to convert, they could rise to the top of the administration, as viziers, admirals, even as grand vizier. This was, of course, no paradise, where everyone could seek sanctity in their own fashion, as Frederick the Great would allow in his lands 300 years later. Muslim rules and customs were always superior, and churches could be desecrated or converted by the will of the Sultan. But Jews, Greek Orthodox, and Armenian Christians found life under the Ottomans a lot more acceptable than the alternative of living in France, Italy, the Empire, or Spain. When Ferdinand and Isabella confronted the Spanish Jews and Muslims with the choice between conversion or expulsion, the Ottomans welcomed these refugees with open arms. Sultan Bayezid II wondered aloud why anyone would call Ferdinand of Aragon the Wise when he sent him such excellent subjects. What the sultans, however, demanded from non-Muslims was loyalty. Their religious leaders were appointed and served at the pleasure of the Sultan. Their privileges could be restricted or revoked at will, their churches and synagogues confiscated and converted, and they had to pay higher taxes than their Muslim neighbors. However, most non-Muslims found these restrictions easy to bear. The empire was growing. It gave them opportunities in commerce and politics, as well as freedoms they could not even dream of anywhere else in Europe. There are Catholic Christians too who moved into the Ottoman Empire, seeking employment for their skills as artisans, engineers, artists, or admirals. For instance, the man who cast the cannon that broke the Theodosian Wall, well, he had been a Hungarian. There was, however, one levy placed upon in particular the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire that we would find unbearable today: the devshirme. Every 4 to 5 years, scouts would go into the Christian communities in the Balkans and the Caucasus to select prepubescent boys based on intellectual and physical capability as well as their looks. They were forcibly removed from their families and sent to Constantinople. Upon arrival, they would be circumcised. Those of superior beauty were selected as palace pages to be trained and educated inside the Topkapi Palace. After a number of years of initial education, a subset of these pretty pages would then be given a ticket to the elite school in the palace grounds that trained the future leaders of the empire. Those who did not pass the first or the second selection process were sent to work on Anatolian farms to toughen them up. They became accustomed to hardship, learned Turkish, and got immersed in the Islamic faith. After 6 to 8 years, they returned to Constantinople and worked as laborers in the palace kitchens, the stables and gardens, or in the arsenal, or in mosque construction, before being enrolled in the Janissaries, the Sultan's feared standing army. The Janissaries initially counted about 7,000 to 8,000 men and continuously expanded until they were hitting a peak at 65,000 in the late 17th century. This Janissary system had been introduced by either Orhan or Murad in the second half of the 14th century, but what changed with Mehmet II was the introduction of this palace school at Topkapi. Those who passed the 2 selection processes were destined to become the leading administrators of the empire. Mehmet II established a complex bureaucracy that included eunuchs in charge of different parts of the royal palace, military judges, civil administrators, financial secretaries, treasurers, and a chancellor. he introduced an imperial council that met 4 times a week. It was to advise the Sultan on administrative, political and military matters. It issued decrees in the ruler's name, it appointed and promoted civil servants, and it acted as a law court for the most serious crimes. The council was led by the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's deputy, who was running the empire and led the armies in war, unless the ruler took charge himself. Under Mehmet II's predecessors, the Grand Vizier and other senior positions were held by members of important Turkish families, much like royal councils in the West were populated by senior aristocrats. In June 1453, immediately after the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmet II had his Grand Vizier Halil Pasha executed. Halil Pasha had counseled against an attack on the city and was accused of taking bribes from the Byzantines. Though the real reason for his disgrace and death was a break in the system. Halil Pasha had inherited the position of Grand Vizier from his father, who was the son of a previous Grand Vizier. Beheading the member of this immensely powerful aristocratic family was Mehmet II's way to decapitate the old aristocratic Turkish elite. The conquest of Constantinople, being blessed by the Prophet, had given him the authority to do this, and his palace school provided him with capable replacements. Most Grand Viziers from then on forward had gone through the Topkapi Palace School, meaning that they were, despite their elevated social position, still slaves. Men who had no power base other than the one granted by the Sultan. It also meant that these men were fiercely loyal to the system that had brought them to power. The administration they led was again made up mainly from men who had gone through the same procedure and who they presumably knew extremely well. Their coherence as a separate class made them difficult to penetrate for domestic or foreign opponents. And given their legal status as slaves, the Sultan could have them removed or killed at any moment for any reason. It is often believed that these boys had been completely brainwashed and had forgotten their Christian families in the Balkans, or that they never had any. But that's not true. They were taken from the age of 10 onwards, so they already had strong memories of where they had grown up. The selectors also preferred children from stable families, as this was supposed to imbue them with moral values. In many cases, they stayed in contact with their mothers, fathers, and siblings, often helping them along financially or to find attractive roles in local administration. So, in a weird way, the administration of this Turkish empire was predominantly in the hand of Christians from the Balkans. Machiavelli summed up the Ottoman system as follows. The entire monarchy of the Turk is governed by one lord. The others are his servants. And dividing his kingdom into sanjaks, he sends there different administrators and shifts and changes them as he chooses. Machiavelli concluded that the Ottoman Empire would be hard to defeat. The regime could not be undermined by fermenting opposition amongst the leading families or corruption of his advisors, because, well, there were no powerful families, and the men in charge did not have the people behind them. But on the flip side, he believed that if the Sultan was ever defeated, it would be easy to hold his lands. Much easier than it would be for the Sultan to hold a Christian kingdom he could defeat more easily. Basically, the Ottoman Empire was the polar opposite of the Holy Roman Empire. Where the Holy Roman Empire was rigid in its religious outlook, the Ottomans were tolerant. As much as the empire was politically fragmented, Ottoman power was consolidated. Ottoman tax collection was reliable and plenty. Imperial tax collection was missing in action. And that meant the Ottomans could and regularly did raise armies 100,000 strong, whilst European powers could at a stretch field 50,000, and only for brief periods of time. One of my favorite authors covering this story, Mark David Baer, described the Sultanate at this time as follows. Emperor and Caesar, Khan and Sultan. The Ottoman dynasty bore all the hallmarks of its Byzantine, Mongol, Turkish and Muslim heritage, a Eurasian amalgam that lasted more than 500 years. With their conquest of the Second Rome, the Ottomans became more like the Byzantines, claiming authority as successors of the Eastern Roman Empire, taking on an imperial ideology, seeing themselves as inheritors of Rome, and adapting its architectural models. As the Ottomans revitalized this dead center of a dead empire, whose revival was fed by repopulating the city with Christians, Jews, and Muslims from the ever-expanding empire, the Islamic world gained an imperial center to match or even surpass Christendom in wealth, size, and magnificence. End quote. All this now begs a fundamental question. Why, as rulers of the most advanced empire and commander of the largest and most modern army of their day, why did neither Mehmet II nor his two successors, Bayezid II and Selim the Grim, go west and roll up the Hungarians, Bohemians, and Austrians before taking Italy and the rest of Europe? Mehmet II had made a first attempt to take Belgrade in 1456, which was unsuccessful thanks to the skill of its defenders. See episode 210 if you want to check back. After that, he turned to the remainders of the Byzantine Empire in Greece and Albania, as well as on Venetian trading posts in the Aegean. However, this was not the big move that one would expect. Maybe there simply wasn't enough bandwidth to do both a massive campaign into Western Europe and the huge reforms he was pushing through in the Ottoman Empire. We should also not forget that the Hungarians under Matthias Corvinus had created one of Europe's most impressive armies and had built a string of fortresses on the border. This was not insurmountable, but it might just hadn't been yet the time for it. Mehmet and Matthias signed various peace agreements over the years that allowed the Hungarian king to indulge in his ambitions in Bohemia and facilitated Turkish raids into Styria and Carinthia. See episode 212. Things got more serious when in 1479 Mehmet II tried his luck with the Knights of St. John at their stronghold in Rhodes. This chivalric order, also known as the Knights Hospitallers, were the last remains of the Crusader states. They had turned the island into a giant fortress and made their money from controlling shipping along the coast of Anatolia. They had become a particular nuisance to the Sultan due to their habit of prying on ships carrying pilgrims on their route to Mecca and Medina. But the siege was repelled. It would take until 1522 before Mehmet's great-grandson Suleiman the Magnificent could expel the knights after an incredibly long and costly siege. Now that effort in Rhodes was followed by another one when he took the city of Otranto in southern Italy. Now this might have been intended as the first step in a larger operation taking advantage of the political fragmentation of the peninsula. You may remember how rapidly the French pushed through from Piedmont to Naples in 1495, so the Italians were justifiably concerned that a Turkish force could rapidly take Rome and then Milan from this bridgehead in Otranto. It was the unexpected death of the great Sultan in 1481 that saved Europe from a full-scale invasion. Now he was, by all accounts, a remarkable man with many facets to his life. Mark David Baer dedicates a whole chapter arguing that he was as much a Renaissance prince as his contemporaries in Italy, France, and the Low Countries. I'm not yet fully convinced by this, but what is hard to deny is that Mehmet II established or improved many institutions that made and maintained the Ottoman Empire as a foremost power in Europe and Asia. But his great construct still had a massive Achilles heel. There was no clear rule for the succession to the Sultanate. It was understood that the Sultan should be succeeded by one of his sons, but it did not say which son. And given a harem full of slave concubines, there were usually lots of sons. In principle, this is supposed to be a meritocracy where the most able of the sons was to follow the father. And to establish their credentials, these sons of the Sultan were given governorships or military commands in the border provinces to prove themselves. Now Mehmet II died unexpectedly, and that meant that on the day of his death, the forerunners for his succession, his sons Bayezid and Cem, were a long way away from the capital. What followed then were 2 weeks of chaos. Without a master to obey, Mehmet's system of slave administrators and slave soldiers collapsed. The body of the Sultan was left forgotten in the palace and allegedly stank tremendously before it was finally buried. And then there was the race of the sons to the capital. Whoever made it there first was likely to become the ruler simply by taking control of the administration. Now that race was won by Bayezid, who became Sultan Bayezid II. His brother Cem, hot on his heels, managed to take the old capital of Bursa just on the other side of the Sea of Marmaris. He was a man popular with the troops and in particular with the Turks of Anatolia. So he too had himself proclaimed Sultan, and he minted his own coins. And then he offered his brother to split the empire. He, Cem, would take the Asian provinces, and Bayezid should be content with the European side. Now that offer was refused, and in the ensuing battle, Bayezid's forces prevailed. Cem fled first to Adana in southern Turkey, and then on to Mamluk Egypt. The Mamluks ruled Syria, Egypt, and what is now Saudi Arabia, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They had custody of the Caliph, the religious leader of the Ummah, the community of the Islamic faith. Their capital, Cairo, was multiples larger than Constantinople, and they also ruled Aleppo, the main trading hub for silk and luxuries from the east. So all that made them the foremost Muslim power. There, Cem hoped to find support for another attempt at dislodging his brother. But following a number of failed attempts, the Mamluks tired of Cem, or Cem of the Mamluks, and he went to Rhodes, the home of the Knights Hospitallers. This was a godsend for Western Europe. Cem, or Gem as the Italians called him, became a permanent threat they dangled before the Sultan Bayezid II. Cem had expected that the Knights of St. John would convey him over to the Hungarians, who had offered him command of their armies in an attack on his brother. But these defenders of the Christian faith did no such thing. Instead, they struck a deal with Bayezid II. Bayezid paid them a generous annual subsidy, and in return they kept Cem as an honored guest in Rhodes. Then the chivalric knights sold Cem to the French, who still prevented him from going to Hungary, and now collected the subsidy from Bayezid II. Bayezid then tried to put an end to this malarkey and allegedly offered the King of France the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in exchange for his brother. That was turned down on the grounds that Bayezid did not yet have Jerusalem, and even the lance that pierced Jesus' side was thrown into the bargain. Still, no takers. Cem was finally handed over to the Pope and lived the life of a wealthy nobleman in Rome. He was paraded as a novelty and appeared in various Renaissance paintings, most prominently in the frescoes of the Borgia apartment in the Vatican, standing next to another contemporary celebrity, Lucrezia Borgia. Now, beyond looking great in a picture, Cem's real value was as a walking insurance policy. As long as he was in Italy and could be deployed to the Hungarian border at any time, Bayezid II did not dare to make any major moves on Western Europe. Only when Cem had died and his body had been returned to Bursa and buried in 1499 did Bayezid make his first move. The Venetian-Ottoman War of 1499 to 1503 cost the Venetians another set of trading posts. But even more importantly, the Ottomans won their first naval battle against the Venetians, which gave them maritime control of their coastline. That was something the Byzantine rulers had lost way back in the 12th century. And it provided the Sultan with another important military tool alongside his janissaries and his cavalry forces. His brother Cem was, however, not Bayezid's only reason to refrain from westward expansion. He also had a huge domestic challenge to deal with, a domestic challenge driven by religious divisions in his empire. Not divisions between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, but amongst the Muslims themselves. Westerners, me included, always see Islam as a unified religion with clear rules adhered to from one end of the Muslim world to the other. Only Sunni and Shia are known distinctions. But like literally every religion ever created, in Islam too, people disagree about matters of faith. As we already talked about in episode 168, where we discussed the early days of the Ottomans, the Turkic tribes of the Anatolian plateau were followers of Sufism, a sort of Islamic mysticism that sought a connection to God through music, dance, and poetry. The best known of their rituals are the dancing dervishes that still exist. They lived in Sufi lodges, not dissimilar to monasteries, and dedicated themselves to worship. And since the days of the poet Rumi, who founded the Mevlevi branch of Sufism, various further branches developed. Some were quite extreme in their practices, shaving off all their hair and walking around naked even in winter. Mehmet II had a good relationship, even with the more extreme groups. And one of these, led by an ascetic wanderer named Ottoman Baba, whose specialty was drinking other people's bathwater, turned on Bayezid. Sufis did believe that in any era there lived a perfect human, the pole who acted as an isthmus between God and humanity. And everyone owed allegiance to the pole and his deputies, even the most powerful sultans. The bathwater drinking Ottoman Baba believed himself to be that pole, the reincarnation of Adam, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Ali, even God. His disciples swallowed all this hook, line, sinker, and bathwater. Now, Ottoman Baba had already died in 1478, but his deputies continued in his vein. And when Bayezid II refused to follow some of their instructions, they tried to assassinate him. And Bayezid reacted brutally. He had the followers of Ottoman Baba tortured and executed, and the rest, including a bunch of other sects, exiled to Anatolia. Now, that was a mistake, a bad one. Because there in Anatolia they found a new leader. Across the border in Persia, Shah Ismail I had just established the Safavid dynasty in Tabriz. Now Ismail I was not only the Persian king, he was also the leader of a radical, mystic, Shiite Sufi sect, whose military wing was made up of Turkmen and Kurdish fighters who were called the Red Hats after their headgear. Now the Red Hats saw Ismail not just as their political and their religious leader, they were convinced that he was at least the perfect human, the pole who was to be obeyed as if he was God, if he wasn't actually God himself. Now such a mystic Sufi leader had a natural appeal to the recently exiled followers of Ottoman Baba. The fact that the Safavids were explicitly Shiite was no hindrance. Many Sufis, including those that enjoyed the patronage of Bayezid II, revered the divine Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. The two branches of Islam had not yet separated as sharply as they have today. Now Bayezid's problems did not end there. The Janissaries, despite being born as Christians, had developed a strong affinity to radical Sufism and hence susceptibility to Safavid propaganda when they went and worked on the farms in Anatolia. And then there were the old Turkish aristocracy that Mehmet II had sidelined and replaced with his palace pages and slave viziers. They wanted back into power. So the net result was a string of Safavid-supported apocalyptic rebellions in Anatolia that had to be crushed with brutal force. And meanwhile, Ismail I had incorporated the White Sheep Confederation that controlled eastern Anatolia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and western Iran. And this success was not just thanks to his religious and military power, but also due to his family connections. Because Ismail I could trace his descent to both the White Sheep rulers and the Byzantine emperor. So the combination of threats, an invasion led by his brother, and the rising power Ismail I in Persia was what blocked Bayezid II. Being stuck without progress was at this time an intolerable situation. The Ottoman Empire had been in constant expansion mode for a century and a half, and this period of defensive stagnation did not go down well with the Ghazis, the Turkish cavalry fighters, nor did it satisfy the Janissaries. And Bayezid II's son, Selim, was the one who could not bear it any longer. Plus, he was just one of several sons and a younger one to boot. But what he had going for him was a great relationship with the troops. He'd been given the governorship of Trebizond on the Persian border. There he had fought incursion after incursion and had gained the respect of his men with ambitious counterattacks and a relaxed attitude to raping and pillaging. In 1511, Selim travelled to Crimea, the former Genoese port of Kaffa, where he deposited his son Suleiman as governor. Now Kaffa was the heart of the second major Ottoman industry, the trade in slaves. The Crimean Tatars would raid Eastern Europe for slaves and bring them to Kaffa for shipment to Constantinople, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. And the scale of this slave trade was humongous. Between 1500 and 1700, an estimated 2 million slaves were transported, a number comparable to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, from this center of human misery, Selim took his forces of loyal soldiers to Edirne to have a chat with his dad. Selim suggested he should be given a governorship closer to Constantinople, just to make sure that he was on hand should, God forbid, the old man pass away unexpectedly and the scenes of Mehmet's death repeated themselves. Somehow Bayezid was not very excited about that and challenged Selim for battle. Selim did in the end not dare to raise his hand against the Sultan and his father, and retreated. Meanwhile, Selim's brother, Ahmed, who was also Bayezid's favorite, went to Constantinople expecting his elderly father would now declare him Sultan. Bayezid may have wanted to do that, but he ran into opposition from the Janissaries. To quote Mark David Baer again, the Janissaries believed Ahmed to be effeminate, a man devoted to pleasure, drinking and music, his only desire to kiss the mouths of rosebud-lipped beauties and to clasp the waists of those whose tall figures resemble cypresses. End quote. Such inclinations turned out to be deadlier than even the moralists could claim. Ahmed had to leave Constantinople. Selim forced his father to abdicate in his favor, and he hunted down his brothers, Ahmed and Korkut, and had them strangled. It's from this point forward that the Sultan would have all his brothers and half-brothers ceremoniously strangled with the finest silk scarves as a matter of course. And to ensure that this could actually be done, the sons were no longer given governorships or military commands in far-flung places. Instead, they were kept in a golden cage in the Topkapi Palace, waiting to be called out either to rule the empire or to be executed. Now that did solve the succession problem, but it created another one. These men who lived in a permanent competition for their own lives with their brothers and were otherwise completely isolated from the outside world, well, they weren't exactly built to be great rulers. The problem did not materialize immediately, as Selim had only one son, Suleiman, and Suleiman grew up in a reasonably normal fashion. But Suleiman's sons and grandsons and further descendants went through this experience and turned out to be, with very few exceptions, utterly incompetent. Their fate was often determined by the political skill of their mothers, who themselves were usually enslaved concubines who played harem politics for their and their sons' survival. But despite this monstrously dysfunctional system to select the monarch, the Ottoman state continued to flourish well into the late 17th century, testament to the resilience of the political system and institutions established by Mehmet II. And that all gets us to the last chapter in today's episode, the military. Selim, often called the Grim, though the correct translation from Turkish is the Awesome, did what he had promised his soldiers long ago. He went to resolve the Safavid problem, and the Mamluk one to boot. In April 1514, after the exchange of delightfully insulting letters and much posturing, Selim mustered his army for the 1800-kilometer march from Edirne to the Safavid capital. On the way, he had tens of thousands of the Red Hats, the religious followers of Shah Ismail I, executed. And on August 23rd, the two armies met at Calderon, near Lake Van. 10,000 Janissaries, armed with muskets, hundreds of cannon, and a further 90,000 men wreaked havoc with the Safavids, who did not have a single firearm. The Ottoman Sultan may not have an exalted bloodline, nor did he have 100,000 fanatical followers who believed him to be a god, but he had guns, and that was enough. Shah Ismail survived the battle and fled. The Ottomans captured his capital, but could not hold it for logistical reasons. Still, Ismail's spell was broken. The man so many people believed was a god had been defeated. There were no more Shia uprisings in Anatolia, and the gap between the two branches of Islam became a chasm. Next, Selim turned on the Mamluks. In 1516 he advanced to Aleppo, one of the richest cities in the Muslim world. Selim's army of his 10,000 musket-bearing janissaries and 60,000 general troops, mostly cavalry, faced up to maybe 20 to 25,000 Mamluks and their Bedouin Arab allies. Again, Mark David Baer described it best, quote, "Despite being surrounded by 40 descendants of the Prophet Muhammad bearing copies of the Quran on their heads and the Caliph, Mamluk Sultan Al-Ghari was killed. The 75-year-old's head presented to Selim and his army defeated. Arquebuses had defeated swords and arrows again." End quote. There was a little bit more fighting, but by April 1517, Selim had taken full control of the Mamluk Empire, all of the Levant, including Aleppo, Damascus, and Jerusalem, Egypt with its magnificent capital of Cairo, and then the jewel in the crown, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Selim I could now call himself the defender of the holy cities and Caliph. He had not only doubled the size of the empire, he had also given legitimacy to the Sultan as the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, a position recognized well beyond the borders of his empire. The wealth of Cairo, Aleppo, and the rapidly growing Constantinople was now in the hands of one man, whose administration was manned by slaves who had to follow his every whim. And all that power was now turning its gaze westwards. Selim left this task to his only son, Suleiman the Magnificent, who took the reins in 1520, ushering in 2 centuries of war between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. But that would go far beyond this episode, which is why we stop here. Next week, we'll get back to the latter days of the Emperor Maximilian, who laid the foundations of that Habsburg Empire that the Ottomans ran up against. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode and the show in general, why don't you open your purse and go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you find various options to keep this show going and advertising free. In the same way as Mr. SCF, Brem R, Adam W, Andrew E, Birkit H, Carl J, Deborah MCK, and Mr. Roy B have already done.